The day Ezekiel Lawson walked into the telegraph office in Redemption, Texas, with mud on his boots and a wound in his chest that had nothing to do with any bullet, the operator on duty, old Percy Finch, later said he had never seen a man look so desperately certain about something so small. It was the autumn of 1882, and the land around Redemption was the color of dried blood and copper, the kind of country that swallowed men whole if they let their attention wander for even a single moment. The cattle drives had been winding down for the season, and the town itself sat at an uneasy crossroads between what the frontier had been and what men with railroad money were trying to make it into. Saloons with names like the Silver Spur and the Dusty Rose still did their brisk business every evening, and the jail on the far end of Main Street had not gone a single week without at least one occupant. But there were also a dry goods store and a schoolhouse and a small white church with a bell that actually worked. And on Sunday mornings, the sound of it rolled out across the flats like something that belonged to a gentler world entirely. Ezekiel was 27 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that men who work cattle tend to become, all muscle and economy of movement, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends when the humidity was high, and eyes the particular shade of gray that can look blue or green depending entirely on what kind of light happens to find them. He had a scar along his left jaw from a fence wire incident when he was 19 that he never bothered explaining to anyone, and he had large hands that were rough with work but capable of surprising gentleness. He was not a man given to excessive talking. His employer, a rancher named Holly's Crew who ran the Double C spread 14 miles east of Redemption, had once said that Ezekiel Lawson could go 3 days on a trail drive without saying more than was strictly necessary, and that a man like that was worth his weight in anything you cared to name. He stepped into the telegraph office just before noon on a Wednesday, and Percy Finch looked up from his desk with the expression of mild annoyance that he reserved for people who interrupted his lunch, which he ate at his desk every day because he could not afford to leave the instrument unattended for long. "Help you," Percy said, setting down his bread. Ezekiel took off his hat, which was a gesture that Percy noticed because most cowboys left their hats firmly on their heads regardless of where they went or what they were doing. It said something, that small removal. It said this man understood that what he was about to do required a certain degree of humility. "I need to send a message," Ezekiel said, "to Kansas, Wichita." Percy pulled a form across the desk and uncapped his ink pen. Name of the recipient, Naomi Beckett. He said the name the way a man says something he has been saying quietly to himself in the dark for a long time, with a kind of worn familiarity that made Percy glance up from the form. "She boards with a woman named Clara Aldridge on 5th Street. Clara Aldridge runs a seamstress shop out of the front room. If the message goes to the shop, Naomi will get it." Percy wrote this down. "And the message?" Ezekiel was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the far wall where Percy had pinned up a map of the telegraph lines, the way they stretched out from town to town across the territory like a web built by something patient and determined. The lines ran north into Kansas, and somewhere at the end of one of those invisible threads was a woman in a seamstress shop on 5th Street in Wichita, and she was the reason this man was standing here with his hat in his hands. "One word," Ezekiel said. Percy blinked. "I beg your pardon. One word is all I need to send. Just one word." Ezekiel reached into his shirt pocket and set a coin on the desk, more than enough to cover even a lengthy message. "The word is come." Percy Finch would tell this story for the rest of his life, and every time he told it he would pause right here, at the moment when Ezekiel Lawson set that coin on the desk and named that single word, because in all his years of operating the telegraph at Redemption, he had sent messages of condolence and messages of celebration and messages of legal business and messages of desperate financial need, and he had never once sent a message that was only a single word. And he had certainly never sent one that felt so heavy with everything it was not saying. He tapped the message out. Come. Just that, and the name of the sender below it, and the address above it. And then the soft clicking of the instrument filled the small room, and the word traveled north on invisible wire, 2 states away, to where Naomi Beckett was threading a needle by the light of a window on 5th Street in Wichita, Kansas. She was 24 years old, and she had been waiting for something, though she would not have put it in precisely those terms if you had asked her. She would have said she was simply living her life, which was true, and that she was content, which was mostly true, and that she had no complaints worth naming, which was the kind of thing people say when they have learned that naming complaints does not necessarily make them go away. Naomi Beckett had come to Wichita 2 years earlier from a small town in Missouri after the death of her mother, who had been the last of her close family. She was not running from anything so dramatic as heartbreak or scandal. She was simply a young woman who had found herself alone in a town full of people who all seemed to have histories she was not part of, and she had made the practical decision to go somewhere else and make herself useful and perhaps find a different kind of belonging. Clara Aldridge had advertised for a seamstress's assistant, and Naomi had answered the advertisement. And for 2 years she had been doing fine work with needle and thread and keeping herself carefully occupied. She had met Ezekiel Lawson 14 months ago, when a cattle drive out of Texas had pushed through Wichita, and the cowboys on it had come to town for 3 days to spend their wages and eat food that had not been cooked over a campfire. She had been coming out of the dry goods store on a Tuesday afternoon when she ran directly into him, which was to say that she stepped off the wooden sidewalk without looking, and he was walking past leading his horse, and they collided in a way that sent her parcels into the dirt and her hat sideways across her face. He had bent to pick up her things before she had even fully registered what had happened, and when she straightened her hat and looked at him, she found him already holding out her parcels with an expression of such genuine concern that she had laughed instead of being annoyed, which surprised them both. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have been watching where I was walking." "You were walking in the street," she said. "I was the one who stepped off without looking." "Still," he said, and he seemed to mean it. They had stood there on the edge of the street for a moment with the town going on around them, and then she had thanked him and taken her parcels and walked back toward the seamstress shop, and she had thought that was the end of it. But Wichita was not so large a town that you could avoid someone entirely, and by the following afternoon she had encountered him again at the feed store where Clara had sent her to inquire about a delivery, and he had been coming out just as she arrived, and he had held the door and then paused. "The woman from the street," he said. "The cowboy from the street," she replied. He smiled then, and she noticed that it changed his whole face. That smile made him look younger and less guarded. "Ezekiel Lawson," he said. "Naomi Beckett." They had talked for 20 minutes on the sidewalk outside the feed store, which was 20 minutes longer than either of them had planned on. And then Clara's delivery situation became pressing, and she had to leave, and he had a horse that needed seeing to. But when she walked back to the shop, she was aware of something warm and slightly disorienting sitting in the middle of her chest like a coal that had just caught light. He had found her again the next morning. He was leaving the following day, he said. The drive was moving on, and he had been walking past the seamstress shop and seen her through the window and thought he would stop. He said this plainly, without embellishment, in the way that a man says something true that he has decided not to dress up. She had come out onto the front step, and they had sat on the edge of the porch in the September sun and talked about nothing consequential for an hour, and then he had said that he was going to be in Texas by winter, but that he would write to her if she would give him an address, and she had given it to him. He had written. Not frequently, because he was a man who worked long days and had limited access to paper and post, but regularly, every few weeks, short letters that were honest and direct in the way his speech was. Letters that said things like, "I have been thinking about the way you laughed when you knocked my hat off your head, and I think about the things you said about your mother sometimes. It seems like she was a remarkable woman." She had written back longer letters because She had more time and more inclination toward words than he did. Letters that described Wichita in the autumn, and Clara's particular opinions on the proper way to sew a collar, and the small annoyances and pleasures of daily life. Letters that did not say everything she was beginning to feel, but that said enough. For 14 months they had existed in this way, separated by the length of 2 states, connected by paper and ink and the uncertain rhythms of the postal service. And then the letters had stopped, not hers, which continued arriving in Texas at irregular intervals and being read and reread in whatever bunkhouse or camp Ezekiel happened to be in, but his, which had grown less frequent through the summer and then gone quiet in August. And it was now October, and she had not heard from him in 6 weeks, and she was telling herself she was not worried about this when the telegraph messenger arrived at Clara Aldridge's seamstress shop on a Thursday morning and handed her a small piece of paper. She was threading a needle, as has been mentioned, by the window light. Clara was in the back room cutting fabric and humming something tuneless. The messenger was a boy of about 14 who came twice a week to deliver messages from the telegraph office across town, and he handed her the paper with the indifferent efficiency of someone who has delivered too many messages to maintain curiosity about any of them. She read the word. She read it again. She sat down on the stool beside the window and looked at it for a long moment, and the word was so simple and so enormous and so entirely like him, like the directness of him, the economy of him, that she felt her throat tighten with something she could not immediately name. It was not uncertainty. It was not indignation. It was something closer to recognition, like hearing a piece of music you have known all your life suddenly played in a room where you are standing and feeling it resonate in your bones. Come. One word, 2 states away, from a man who did not waste words on things he did not mean. Clara came in from the back room and found her sitting by the window with the telegraph paper in her hands, and an expression on her face that Clara, who was 53 years old and had been widowed twice, and had seen love come and go in the lives of everyone around her with the persistence of weather, recognized immediately. "What is it?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew. "A message from Texas," Naomi said, and Naomi held up the paper. Clara leaned forward and read the single word and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Well, are you going?" "I don't know yet," Naomi said, which was not entirely true. Clara sat down in the chair across from her and folded her hands in her lap in the manner of a woman who has things to say and intends to say them carefully. "Naomi," she said, "I have known you for 2 years, and in 2 years I have seen you pick up a letter from that cowboy in Texas and carry it around in your apron pocket for 3 days before you read it, because you wanted to be sure you were ready. And I have watched you read every single one of those letters at least 4 times, and I have heard you laughing in your room when you think no one can hear you. And I am telling you as someone who has been a fool about love twice and is therefore qualified to speak on the subject, do not be a fool about it a 3rd time. Not yours. Do not be a fool by waiting when the word is already sitting in your hand." Naomi looked at the paper again. "He might only mean to visit," she said. "He sent 1 word," Clara said. "A man who meant for you to visit sends more words than that. A man who sends 1 word means everything the word contains." That night, alone in her small room above the shop, Naomi Beckett laid out the question the way she would lay out a piece of fabric before cutting, looking at it from all angles to understand what was being asked of it. She had no family to consult. She had a good situation here, a job and a room and a woman who had become something close to family over 2 years of close quarters. She had a life that was, by any reasonable measure, sufficient. But there was the word on the paper. There was the particular way her chest had felt when she read it, like something shifting into a place it had been trying to find for a long time. There were 14 months of letters from a man who wrote plainly and honestly, and did not say things he did not mean. And there was one afternoon on a feed store sidewalk in September and an hour on a porch in the same September sunshine. And all of it added up not to a guarantee, but to something she trusted more than a guarantee, which was evidence. She began to write a letter that night, but she stopped after 2 lines because a letter would take weeks, and the word had been come, not write back, and she thought she understood the urgency in it even though she did not yet know what had prompted it. She made her decision before she fell asleep. The next morning she told Clara, and Clara said nothing except to pull her into an embrace that lasted long enough to say everything that needed saying. And then she pressed a small amount of money into Naomi's hand and said, "For the train. Don't argue with me about it." Naomi argued anyway, but Clara was unmovable on the subject. And in the end she accepted it because she was practical, and the train to Texas was not free. She spent 2 days settling her affairs, which were not complicated affairs but which needed attending to, and she packed one trunk with everything that mattered to her. And on a Saturday morning in the middle of October 1882, she boarded the southbound train at the Wichita station with her trunk in the baggage car and her good coat over her arm and a ticket to Redemption, Texas, purchased at a cost that used most of what Clara had given her and most of what she had saved. And she sat in her seat and watched Kansas slide away through the window and did not let herself think too hard about what she was doing, because she had already thought about it as hard as it needed to be thought about. The train journey was 2 days with changes at 2 junctions, and she sat through the hours of it with the careful composure of a woman who is managing a considerable amount of feeling by applying attention to her surroundings. The landscape changed as she went south, the flat agricultural land of Kansas giving way to something rougher and more open, the sky getting wider and the colors shifting toward that reddish copper that defined the Texas plains. She had never been to Texas. She looked at it coming and thought that it was the kind of country you either loved immediately or found oppressive, and she was surprised to discover that it was pulling at something in her that felt, against all reasonable expectation, like recognition. She arrived in Redemption on a Monday afternoon, which was a gray and blustery day with dust moving in sheets across the main street, and she stepped off the train onto the platform with her trunk and her coat, and no knowledge of where the Double C Ranch was or whether Ezekiel Lawson even knew she was coming. He did not know she was coming. That was the thing about sending one word. It did not allow for the logistics of reply. He had sent the word and then spent the days afterward in a state of suspended uncertainty, not knowing if she would receive it and not knowing if she would come, and not knowing how long to wait before he began to understand that she was not coming, or that she had received the word, and decided that one word from a cowboy in Texas was not sufficient grounds for crossing 2 states. He had sent the word because something had happened in late August that had clarified for him, with the kind of startling precision that only crisis can produce, exactly what mattered and what did not. He had been out on the range with 2 other hands from the Double C, checking the fence line on the eastern boundary, when his horse had stepped badly coming down a rocky slope and thrown him, and he had hit the ground hard and lain there for a moment with the breath knocked entirely out of him, looking up at a sky that was very wide and very indifferent. And the first thing he had thought, before pain and before the practical assessment of injury, was Naomi's name. Just her name, sitting in his mind with the clarity of something that had always been true and that he had been getting around to acknowledging. He had not been seriously hurt. A bruised shoulder and a cut on his hand and a shaken dignity. But the fall had done something to his understanding of himself and what he wanted his life to contain. And when he was back on the horse and riding in, he had turned the thing over in his mind for the rest of the day, and by evening had arrived at a certainty so clean and simple that it surprised him with its own simplicity. He loved her. He had loved her for some time, probably since that afternoon on the feed store sidewalk, possibly since the moment she had laughed instead of being irritated when they collided in the street. He loved her in the way that a quiet man loves, which is to say deeply and without much external demonstration, but with a thoroughness that had gotten into every part of him without his entirely noticing, until the moment he was lying on the ground looking up at that sky. He had let the letters go too long. He was aware of that. The truth was that he had been trying to figure out how to say what he wanted to say, and the words had kept not quite arriving, and 6 weeks had passed without him writing, which was wrong of him, and he knew it was wrong of him. And the fall from the horse had convinced him that waiting for the perfect arrangement of words was a fool's game when one absolutely necessary word already existed. So he had ridden into Redemption on a Wednesday morning and walked into Percy Finch's telegraph office and sent it. And now it was Monday afternoon, 8 days later, and he was out on the range doing the work of moving cattle to winter pasture with 2 other double C hands, a taciturn older man named Dewey Stratton, and a younger fellow named Cal Whitmore, who had a tendency to narrate everything that happened as if he were already telling the story of it to someone at a bar later. The afternoon light was coming in at a low gold angle, and the cattle were moving tolerably well, and Ezekiel was in that particular mode of automatic physical competence that allows a man to do skilled work, while his mind is somewhere else entirely. Cal was the one who spotted the wagon coming across the flat from the direction of town. It was Holly's crew's buckboard, driven by one of the ranch boys, and it was coming with a purpose and a speed that made Dewey say, "Something's up," with the flatness of a man who has seen things come across flats before. Ezekiel rode out to meet the buckboard, and the boy driving it, a 16-year-old named Thomas, pulled up and said, "Mr. Lawson, there's a woman arrived on the train today from Kansas asking about you. Mr. Crew said to come find you." The world seemed to slow down for a moment, the cattle lowed somewhere behind him. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like something breathing. What did she look like? Ezekiel said, and then felt immediately foolish for asking it, as if there were going to be multiple women arriving from Kansas on a Monday afternoon asking after him. Thomas described her with the innocent inaccuracy of a 16-year-old boy, which was to say that his description was mostly useless for identification purposes, but that it included the phrase, "real pretty, sir," and she seemed like she wasn't afraid of anything, which Ezekiel found he did not need translated. "Where is she now?" he asked. "Mr. Crew's wife took her in. She's at the house." He looked back at Dewey, who was watching him with the expression of a man who has already understood the situation and is waiting for the younger man to catch up. "Go," Dewey said. "Cal and I can manage the rest of this." Ezekiel did not need to be told twice. He turned his horse and pushed it into a gallop across the flat, toward the ranch house, and the gold afternoon light came with him, and the dust rose up behind him, and he was aware of his heart doing something it did not usually do, which was making itself very much known. The Double C main house was a solid structure built of local stone and timber, not elegant but permanent, sitting behind a set of corrals with a well and a bunkhouse, and a cookhouse arranged around it in the practical geometry of working ranch life. Holly's crew was a man of about 50 with a broad red face and a reasonable nature, and his wife Meredith was a woman of similar age who had the reputation of being the most capable person within 40 miles in any direction, which was saying something given the general capability level of people who chose to live in that country. Ezekiel came into the yard at a pace that made the chickens scatter and pulled up at the hitching post by the main house. He swung down and tied the horse and stood for a moment, suddenly aware that he was dusty from a day's work and that his hat was sweat-stained, and that he had not prepared for this in any way whatsoever. He took a breath. He straightened his coat. He knocked on the door. Meredith Crew opened it and looked at him with the amused comprehension of a woman who has been expecting him. "She's in the parlor," Meredith said, "and you look like you rode hard to get here. Do you want to wash first?" "No, ma'am," he said. Meredith stepped aside and he went in. The parlor was a small room with a braided rug and 2 chairs, and a settee, and a window that looked out across the yard toward the open range beyond. There was a trunk sitting by the door that had not been there this morning, And there was Naomi Beckett sitting on the edge of the settee with her hands in her lap, and her good coat still on, as if she was not entirely sure she was going to be staying, looking at him with an expression that contained more things than he was going to be able to sort through immediately. She was exactly as he remembered her, and also more than he remembered her, which is how it goes with people we love, that they are always slightly beyond the versions of them we carry around in our heads. She had dark hair pinned up with several of it coming loose from the journey, and her eyes were brown and direct, and her face was the face he had been writing letters to for 14 months, and she was here. She was in Texas. She had come. He took off his hat. "You got my message," he said. It was not the most eloquent thing he had ever said, but it was true. "One word," she said. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it. "You sent me one word, Ezekiel Lawson." "I know," he said. "You stopped writing for 6 weeks and then you sent one word." "I know," he said again, and then, because he understood that she deserved more than 2-word acknowledgments of his own shortcomings, he said, "I am sorry for the 6 weeks. I was trying to find the right way to say something and I couldn't find it, and then I realized that finding the right words was less important than saying the necessary word, so I sent that one." She looked at him for a moment. "What were you trying to say?" He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her and put his hat on his knee and said, "That I don't want to keep doing this. I don't want to write letters and wait weeks for answers and have you be 2 states away while I'm here trying to figure out who I'm going to be. I want you to be part of what I'm figuring out. He stopped. He looked at his hat for a moment and then looked back at her. "I want to marry you, Naomi. If you'll have me. That's what I've been trying to say for 6 weeks." The room was very quiet. Outside, one of the horses shifted in the corral, and the sound of it came through the window like a small punctuation mark. Naomi was quiet for a moment, and he let her be quiet because she was the kind of person who thought before she spoke, and he respected that about her even when the silence was difficult to sit in. Then she said, "You sent me one word and you couldn't even send me come marry me." He looked at her and she looked at him, and then the corner of her mouth moved upward just slightly, and he felt something enormous and warm settle in his chest. "The message was priced by the word," he said. She laughed. She laughed the way she had laughed when she collided with him in the street that first day, with her whole self, and he thought it was the best sound he had heard in 6 weeks and possibly longer than that. "Yes," she said, when the laughter had settled into something quieter and more serious. "Yes, Ezekiel, that's my answer. Yes." He reached across and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that in the Cruz parlor in the October afternoon light for a moment that felt complete in itself, like a sentence that has finally been finished after a long and uncertain construction. Meredith Crew, who had been in the kitchen with extremely good hearing, allowed herself a small, satisfied nod, and began making plans for a larger supper. It was decided, after some practical conversation over that larger supper, that Naomi would stay in Redemption rather than at the ranch, which was the appropriate and respectable arrangement, and Meredith Crew, who seemed to know everyone within the considerable radius of her influence, arranged for Naomi to board with a widow named Agnes Hallbrook, who lived in a tidy house on the east side of Redemption's Main Street, and who took in respectable women boarders on a reliable basis. Agnes Hallbrook was 61 years old, spare and sharp-eyed and fundamentally good-natured, with a house full of the accumulated evidence of a long and interesting life, and a habit of offering an opinion whether it had been requested or not. She took to Naomi immediately, which Naomi suspected had something to do with Meredith Crew's introduction, and something to do with the fact that Naomi helped with the washing up without being asked, and could hold up her end of a conversation about almost anything. The town of Redemption got used to Naomi's presence quickly in the way that small towns do, which is to say that within a week everyone knew who she was, where she was from, and why she had come, and within 2 weeks most of them had formed opinions about her that they were willing to share with anyone who showed interest. The opinions were, on the whole, favorable, because she was competent and pleasant, and she had a directness that the frontier people understood and respected, and also because she had arrived in response to a telegraph message that consisted of a single word, which was the kind of story that people in Redemption found genuinely entertaining. Percy Finch told it, of course. He could not resist. Within 3 days of Naomi's arrival, every person who entered his telegraph office had heard the version of events that featured Percy himself as a central figure of insight and romantic understanding. And by the end of the week, the story had migrated to the saloons and the feed store and the church, where the Reverend Elias Marsh had used it as the basis for a Sunday morning observation about the economy of honest communication, which several members of his congregation found more practical than his usual sermons. Ezekiel rode into town every few days, on the evenings when the ranch work allowed it, and these visits settled into a pattern that was both exciting and comfortable, which is perhaps the best thing a pattern can be. They would sit on Agnes Holbrook's front porch in the early evenings and talk, really talk, in a way that the letters had allowed them to approach but never quite achieve. Because there is a difference between written words and spoken ones, between a page and a face, and they had 14 months of things to catch up on, and also the ordinary business of learning each other in the specific and irreducible way that physical proximity makes possible. He told her about the fall from the horse and what it had clarified. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about her that he found most remarkable, her ability to actually listen to a thing before responding to it. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "I want to tell you something honestly. When your letters stopped, I told myself I wasn't worried. I was worried." "You had a right to be," he said. "I handled it wrong." "I'm not saying that to assign blame," she said. "I'm saying it because I think we should be honest about what we feel rather than waiting until we find the right arrangement of words for it. I understand that you are more careful with words than I am. I think that's actually one of the things I like about you, that you mean what you say. But there is a middle ground between saying everything imperfectly and saying nothing until you've found the perfect version." He thought about this. "One word," he said. "One word was good," she said. "But send it sooner next time." He looked at her in the last of the daylight, and something about the quality of her, the directness and the warmth and the humor running underneath everything, made him feel like a man who has been traveling a long way in difficult country and has just found the place he was heading toward. "I will," he said. The weeks passed, and Naomi found herself constructing a life in Redemption with the practical efficiency she brought to everything. She went to Agnes Holbrook and offered to help with the sewing and mending that Agnes took in as extra income, and Agnes accepted gratefully, and word got around that there was a skilled seamstress at the Holbrook house, and within a month Naomi had enough paying work to cover her board and have something left over. She liked the town more than she had expected to. There was a roughness to it, certainly, and the violence that the frontier carried in its bones was never very far below the surface. The drunk men on weekend nights, and the disputes over land and water that occasionally became physical, and the general sense that laws were understood to be a framework rather than a guarantee. But there was also a community to it, a network of mutual obligation and practical assistance that she recognized from its absence in the more anonymized life of a larger town like Wichita. People here knew each other and helped each other with the unspoken understanding that help would be needed by everyone eventually, and it was better to build the kind of place where it was given. She made friends. Agnes was the primary one, an unlikely friendship between a young woman of 24 and a widow of 61 that was nonetheless genuine and sustaining. She also befriended the wife of the town's blacksmith, a Mexican woman named Renata Vega, who had been living in Redemption for 8 years, and who had a humor so dry it sometimes took Naomi a moment to realize she'd been funny. Renata had come from a family in New Mexico and had married the blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Samuel Vega, and she navigated the particular complications of being a Mexican woman in a Texas border town with a combination of dignity and practicality that Naomi found both admirable and instructive. The town was not without its difficulties and its injustices, which were real and present, and a part of the world they all lived in. There were people in Redemption who regarded Renata with suspicion or hostility that had nothing to do with who she was as a person, and everything to do with the fear and prejudice that ran through the territory like an underground water source, invisible but structuring everything above it. There were Comanche and Kiowa people whose land the frontier had been built on, and whose situation in 1882 was one of dispossession and confinement, reduced to reservation life by the force of the American expansion that had proceeded largely without regard for what it was displacing. Naomi had not grown up thinking about these things in any systematic way, but the frontier made them visible in ways that a Missouri town had not, and she thought about them in the evenings and asked Renata about them, and listened to what Renata said with the care of someone who understands that listening is not a passive act. Ezekiel thought about them too, in his quiet way, and she found that this was another point of connection between them, not that they had the same politics or the same history of thought on the subject, but that they both took seriously the idea that the world they lived in contained injustices that deserved acknowledgement even when acknowledging them did not immediately produce a solution. He had ridden with Comanche traders in his early cowboy years, and had a respect for the country's original inhabitants that was more than sentimental, and he had seen enough of how the law operated in the territory to know that it operated unevenly depending on who you were and what you looked like. In November, there was a situation. It began with a man named Garrett Holt, who was a cattleman from the county to the north with an ongoing dispute over water rights on the boundary between his land and the Double C. The dispute was the kind that had been going on for years in the territory, men with adjacent land and insufficient water making competing claims on the streams and springs that their cattle depended on. The legal framework for resolving these disputes was incomplete and inconsistently applied, which meant that they tended to resolve themselves through other means. Garrett Holt arrived at the Double C on a November morning with two of his men and words that were aggressive enough to constitute a threat, and Holly's crew listened to him from the front steps of the ranch house with the controlled patience of a man who has been dealing with this particular problem for a long time and has not yet found a resolution that satisfies him. Ezekiel was in the yard and heard the exchange from a distance, and he could tell from the set of Holly's shoulders that the situation had moved into the category that required attention. He walked over, not urgently, not in a way that would escalate, but with the steady, purposeful movement of a man who intends to be present. Holt glanced at him, and Ezekiel said, "Morning," which was not a challenging thing to say, but which established that there was another person present who was paying attention. The confrontation did not become violent that morning. Holt and his men left, and Holly said nothing for a moment after they went, just looked out at the land with the expression of a man calculating. Then he said, "We're going to need to resolve this before winter, or I think it's going to get worse." "What do you need from me?" Ezekiel asked. "Ride out to the boundary spring tomorrow and check what's happening with the channel on the north side. I want to know if he's been interfering with the flow." Ezekiel rode out the next morning and spent several hours at the boundary spring examining the channel and the recent evidence around it, and he found what he found, which was that someone had been doing some earthwork that was directing the flow in Holt's favor. He could not prove who had ordered it, but the evidence was plain enough. He came back and told Holly's, and Holly said, "I was afraid of that." And then they had a practical conversation about what could be done within the law and what the law was likely to actually produce, and how those two things were not always the same. Naomi knew something was troubling him when he came to see her that evening. She knew it the way you know the weather, from small signs that would be invisible to anyone not paying attention. He was quieter than usual, and his jaw had the particular set of someone working through a problem. She did not ask him about it immediately but made tea, which Agnes kept in good supply, and they sat on either side of the kitchen table because the evening had turned cold enough to make the porch impractical, and after a while he told her. She listened to the whole of it and then said, "What is Holly's going to do? He's going to file a legal complaint with the county, which will take months and probably produce nothing useful, and in the meantime Holt is going to keep diverting the water. And you?" "I work for Holly's. I'll do what he asks me to do, but I don't like waiting while someone does a wrong thing and the law moves at the speed it moves." She understood this. She also understood that the version of this problem in which things went badly involved men with guns, and she said, "Ezekiel, whatever Holly's asks you to do, make sure it's something that brings you home." He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them made his face warm and cast shadows that softened the lines around his eyes, and she thought that she was sitting in a kitchen in Texas having tea with a man she was going to marry, and that the ordinariness of it was not diminishing, but was instead one of the most significant and beautiful things she had ever participated in. "I'll be careful," he said. "I know you will. I'm saying be more careful than that." He reached across and covered her hand with his. "Yes, ma'am," he said, with just enough humor to make her feel that he had heard what she was actually saying. The dispute over the water was resolved, though not as quickly or cleanly as anyone would have preferred. Holly's crew's legal complaint moved through the county system with the glacial pace of frontier bureaucracy, and in the meantime Ezekiel and two other hands from the Double C rode the boundary line with enough regularity that Holt's men seemed to find it inconvenient to continue their earthworks. There were two further confrontations over the following weeks, both of them tense and both of them ultimately diffused by the specific form of patience that the territory produced in men who understood that being right and being smart about being right were two different skills. By December, Holt had agreed to a surveyor's assessment of the water rights, which was not a perfect outcome, but was a legal one that was likely to hold. Through all of this, the thing between Ezekiel and Naomi was growing in the way that things grow in good conditions, steadily and with increasing depth. They were not people who performed their feelings for an audience. They were private in their way, not secretive but unshowy, and their courtship had the quality of something built rather than discovered, the gradual construction of understanding and trust, and the specific kind of intimacy that grows from really knowing what another person thinks and values and fears. He had given her a ring in November, simple because he was not a wealthy man, but chosen with the careful attention he gave to anything that mattered, a slender gold band with a small garnet set in it that had been his grandmother's, kept through years of moving because it was the one thing that had felt too important to leave behind. When he gave it to her, they were on Agnes Hallbrook's front porch in the November cold, and he had fumbled the presentation somewhat because he had planned to say something, and then the words had not cooperated, and he had finally just taken the ring out of his pocket and held it out and said, "I wanted you to have this." And she had looked at it and then at him and said, "Are you asking me again, or are you telling me?" And he had said, "Both," and she had laughed and said yes again, the second yes, the one that put the ring on her finger. Agnes had seen the ring at breakfast the next morning and had said, without preamble, "Well, it's about time," and then had proposed that the wedding should happen before the real cold set in, which was sensible advice from a woman who had lived through several Texas winters and knew that January was not the month for celebrations. The wedding was set for the third Saturday in December, which gave them 6 weeks to prepare, and the preparation turned out to be a community event in the way that things in Redemption tended to be, with people showing up to contribute what they could because a wedding was an occasion, and occasions were scarce and valuable in a place where the daily texture of life was mostly work. Renata Vega contributed flowers, winter-dried ones that she had been collecting through the fall, arranged into something beautiful with the skill of a woman who took beauty seriously as a form of resistance against the harshness of the country. Agnes contributed the parlor of her house, which was the largest private indoor space available after the church, and Meredith Crew contributed food in quantities that suggested she had started preparing in October. The dress was something Naomi made herself, because she was a seamstress, and because making the dress felt important, like putting her own hands into the foundation of the thing. She had cream-colored wool, which was practical for December and also lovely, and she worked on it in the evenings and the quiet hours of the morning before Agnes was up. And Clara Aldridge, to whom she had written to describe the situation in a letter of considerable length, and with a degree of happiness that even her careful way with words could not quite contain, had sent a length of ivory ribbon from Wichita that arrived by post in the last week of November like a blessing traveling overland. She wore the ribbon at her waist on the wedding day, and she carried Renata's dried flowers, and she walked down Agnes Holbrook's parlor on Agnes's arm because there was no father to walk with her, and Agnes was the closest thing to family she had in Texas. And the Reverend Marsh presided with a warmth that exceeded his usual Sunday manner, and Hollis and Meredith Crew were there with several of the Double C hands, including Dewey Stratton, who had put on a clean shirt for the occasion and stood with his hands folded in front of him with the expression of a man who takes ceremonies seriously, and Cal Whitmore, who cried, which no one mentioned afterward. Ezekiel was waiting for her at the front of the room, and he watched her come down the length of Agnes's parlor with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not the formal solemnity that occasions are supposed to produce, but something more genuine than that. Something unguarded and full of a warmth so complete, it was almost painful to look at directly. He had done his best with his appearance, clean-shaved and his good coat brushed and his hair as cooperative as it was ever going to be, and he was the handsomest thing she had ever seen, which she had not expected to think quite so plainly. He took her hand at the front of the room and looked at her and said, quietly just for her, "Thank you for coming." She tightened her hand around his. "Thank you for asking," she said, "even if you did only use one word." The Reverend Marsh, who had almost certainly heard this exchange, managed to keep his expression appropriately solemn for the duration of the ceremony, though those standing close to him said afterward that his eyes were smiling the entire time. The vows, they said, were the traditional ones, the words that had been said in ceremonies all across the country for generations, but they said them with a specific weight that the words carry when the people speaking them genuinely mean every part of what they are agreeing to. The richer and the poorer and the sickness and the health, the forsaking of all others and the holding until death, all of it said in the voice of people who have thought about what it means and are choosing it with full knowledge. They were married on the 15th of December, 1882, in Agnes Holbrook's parlor in Redemption, Texas, and afterward everyone ate the food that Meredith Crew had prepared, which was the kind of food that occasions are improved by, and someone had brought a fiddle player, and someone else had moved the furniture to make room, and Naomi danced with Ezekiel on the cleared floor of Agnes's parlor in the light of several good oil lamps, while the fiddle played something old and familiar. And she thought that she was the happiest she had ever been, which was not a thought she examined very carefully because it was one of those thoughts that is better felt than analyzed. Hollis Crew had offered them the use of a small foreman's cabin on the Double C property, which had been empty since the previous foreman had moved on, and they had spent the weeks before the wedding making it habitable, which had been another kind of courtship in itself, the practical intimacy of two people setting up a shared space. It was a stone and wood structure with 2 rooms and a fireplace and a proper stove, and it sat on a rise with a view of the range that was genuinely beautiful in the mornings and the evenings when the light was doing something interesting. They went to it as a married couple on the night of the 15th of December, and the fire was burning because one of the Double C hands had seen to it as a wedding gift, and there was a cold, clear sky full of stars outside the window, and the cabin felt like theirs in a way that a place can feel when you are beginning something in it. Winter on the Texas plains was not the killing cold of the northern states, but it had its own character, a dryness and a wind that got into everything, and a quality of light that was silver and flat in the short days and ice-clear on the nights. Ezekiel and Naomi built their winter life together with the industry of people who are good at making things work. He continued his work at the Double C, which in winter meant fence maintenance and livestock management, and all the quiet labor that ranch keeping requires when the driving season is over. She continued her seamstress work, which kept her usefully occupied and contributed to their finances, and she also turned her attention to the cabin itself, to the small improvements that accumulate into a home. She cooked. She was a good cook, better than she had expected to be since her mother had died before she had really learned everything she wanted to learn. But she had been working at it, and she had Agnes's advice and Renata's occasional instruction in things that required chili peppers and cumin and techniques that were entirely new to her, but that she found she loved. The cabin smelled of food in the evenings when Ezekiel came in from the range, and he said once that coming home to that smell was one of the best things he knew, which was not a showy compliment but which she received as one anyway. They talked in the evenings in a way that deepened everything. They talked about what they wanted their life to look like in 5 years, in 10, and about the ranch and about the territory and about books, because she had brought books in her trunk, and he turned out to be a more active reader than she had expected from someone who was so economical with words himself. They talked about her mother and about his family, which was a complicated subject because his father had been a difficult man, and the relationship had not been warm, but they talked about it honestly rather than around it. He told her about the years before she knew him, the early cattle driving years when he was 17 and 18, and the territory was rougher than it was now, and he had seen things that had taken some time to reckon with. He told her about a season in New Mexico when he had been part of a drive that had gone badly, not through violence but through a drought that had killed a third of the herd and left the hands unpaid and hungry, and about the particular quality of that kind of failure, the kind that is nobody's fault, and that the country simply hands you. She told him about her mother's last months and about the grief of it, which she had been managing on her own for 2 years because grief without family to share it with is a particularly solitary project. She cried once, telling him, and he held her with a steadiness that said he understood that crying was not a problem to be solved but a thing to be present for, and she thought that he had learned that somehow, either from his own experience or from some innate understanding, and she was grateful for it. They were happy. This is not a complicated thing to say, but it is sometimes a rare one, and it was genuinely true of them in those winter months. They were happy in the way that is built rather than the way that merely arrives, the happiness that comes from two people who are actively choosing each other, and doing the work of understanding each other, and finding in that work something that sustains them. Spring came to the Texas plains in February, which is to say that the light began to change, and the cold began to moderate, and the land started doing what the land does when it wakes up. And with the spring came the beginning of the preparations for the next cattle season, and the particular energy that comes back to a working ranch when the year begins in earnest. Naomi discovered she was expecting a baby in March, which was to say that the signs accumulated over several weeks until they were no longer deniable, and she sat with this knowledge alone for 3 days before telling Ezekiel, not out of hesitation or worry, but because she wanted to be certain, and because she wanted the moment of telling him to be a considered one. She had thought about how to do it and then abandoned all her plans and simply told him one evening over supper, directly and plainly, because that was how they were with each other. He set down his fork. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "I am well," she said. "I am feeling somewhat unwell in the mornings, but I am well." He got up and came around the table, and she stood and he held her, not dramatically but completely, with his arms around her and his face in her hair, and she could feel his heart going at a pace that was faster than usual. "Naomi," he said into her hair, and that was all just her name, but he said it in a way that contained everything that her name in his voice had always seemed to contain, which was recognition and tenderness, and something that was simply, irreducibly love. They told Agnes Holbrook first, because Agnes was family in the way that people who fill families' roles become family, and Agnes put both hands over her mouth and then said, "Oh, my dears," with a sincerity so complete that Naomi had to blink rapidly several times. They told the crews, and Meredith embraced Naomi with the warmth of a woman who has no children of her own and has turned that love outward toward everyone around her. They told Renata, who said something in Spanish that Naomi didn't understand, and then translated it as roughly meaning that good things happen to people who are brave, which Naomi found to be a generous interpretation of events. The summer of 1883 was a full one. The cattle season was active and the range work was demanding, and Naomi's pregnancy progressed through the hot months with the pragmatic patience of a woman who is too busy to be incapacitated. She continued her seamstress work through most of the summer, sitting by the window of the cabin with the morning light coming in and the work going through her hands, and she expanded it during this period by beginning to teach 2 girls from the town to sew, which they needed to learn, and which she found she enjoyed teaching. She wrote to Clara Aldridge, long and full letters, and Clara wrote back, and a box arrived from Wichita in June containing small things that Clara had made and gathered, items for the baby that were so carefully chosen and so beautifully made that Naomi wept over them at the kitchen table in a way that she later attributed partially to sentiment and partially to her general hormonal state. Ezekiel came in and found her at the table with the items from the box arranged in front of her and her face wet and said, with concern, "What happened?" "Clara sent things for the baby," Naomi said. "He looked at the items on the table. He looked at her face. And that's why you're crying." "Yes," she said. He sat down next to her and looked at everything Clara had sent. "These are beautiful things," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm crying." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and she felt the solidity of him beside her, the particular comfort of someone you love being present in the body, actually there. And she thought for the 100th time about the word that had brought her here, the one word sent 2 states away, and she thought that it had contained so much more than anyone looking at it from the outside could have understood, that it had contained everything that followed from it. The ring and the wedding and the cabin and the winter evenings and the letters and the conversations and the life that was growing in her body and the letters from Clara and all of it packed into 4 letters and a period sent by a man who understood that sometimes you do not need many words, only the right one. The baby was born in November of 1883, 1 year after Naomi had arrived in Redemption on the train from Wichita. He was a boy, which surprised no one in the room more than it surprised Naomi, who had somehow assumed a daughter through the entire summer, and he came into the world with the vigorous protests of someone who has opinions about the transition he is being asked to make. The midwife, a capable woman named Sarah Dove, who had brought half the children in the county into the world, managed the proceedings with the calm efficiency of long experience, and Meredith Crew was there, because she had appointed herself present, and no one had thought to challenge this. And Agnes was there, because Agnes was always where she was needed. Ezekiel was not in the room, because that was not how things were done, but he was outside the door for the entire duration, which he later said had been one of the longer experiences of his life, sitting with the door between him and everything that mattered, listening. When Sarah Dove came out and told him he had a healthy son and that Naomi was well, he put his face in his hands for a moment in the gesture of a man allowing himself to feel a thing completely before he puts it back where it belongs. He was allowed in shortly after, and he sat on the edge of the bed with his son in his arms for the first time, and looked at the boy with an expression so undisguised that Naomi, watching from the pillow, felt something happen in her chest that she thought might be the feeling of a life coming into full focus. "He needs a name," she said. "I know," Ezekiel said, not taking his eyes off the boy. "Do you have thoughts?" "I was thinking Thomas," he said. After nobody in particular, just because it seemed like a name a person could grow into. Naomi considered this. "Thomas Lawson," she said. "Yes, that fits." Thomas Lawson it was, and he was, from the beginning, a person with a strong will and large gray eyes that he had from his father, and a way of looking at the world that suggested he was already forming opinions about it. He did not sleep any more than was absolutely required of him, and he was interested in everything. And Naomi spent the first months of his life in the particular exhausted happiness of a new mother who is also deeply, thoroughly glad. Ezekiel was, as she had known he would be, a father of remarkable steadiness. He was not the kind to perform his parenthood for an audience, but he was present in the way that mattered, carrying the boy in the evenings when the evenings permitted it, and sitting with him in the night when Naomi needed rest, and learning the specific language of this particular infant's communication, with the same patient attention he brought to everything. The second year of their marriage deepened in the way that second years do, with the addition of the child and the settling of patterns, and the accumulation of the small things that become the texture of a shared life. There were hard weeks and easy weeks and weeks that were simply full, and they moved through all of them with the particular grace of two people who have decided that they are going to keep choosing each other, and for whom that decision is not a burden but a practice. The Double C continued to do well, and Holly's crew, who had developed a genuine appreciation for Ezekiel's combination of competence and judgment, began talking about the possibility of Ezekiel taking on the foreman's role when Dewey Stratton eventually retired, which Dewey had been vaguely threatening to do for the past 3 years. This was not immediately and was nothing more than a conversation, but it was the kind of conversation that changes the shape of the future, and Ezekiel and Naomi talked about it in the way they talked about things, carefully and honestly, examining what it would mean and what it would require. She was in favor of it. Not because of the additional wages, though those would matter, but because she could see in him the capacity for that kind of responsibility, and she thought it would be right for him, would fit the size of who he was in a way that being one of several hands did not entirely accommodate. He was quieter about it, which was how he was about things he wanted, careful not to want them too audibly in case they did not arrive, but she knew him well enough by now to read what was underneath the quiet. "You should tell Hollies you want it," she said one evening in the direct way that was hers. "He'll offer it when the time is right," Ezekiel said. "Maybe. Or he'll assume you're content as you are and offer it to someone else." Ezekiel, wanting something and saying so is not the same as demanding it. It's just honest. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had come to know, the one that meant he was listening not just to the words but to what was underneath them. "You're right," he said, which he said with a willingness that she found every time to be one of his most attractive qualities. He spoke to Hollies, who had in fact been uncertain whether Ezekiel wanted the additional responsibility or preferred the freedom of being a hand rather than a supervisor, was grateful for the conversation, and they made an agreement that when the time came the role would be Ezekiel's. Dewey Stratton retired the following spring, citing needs that had made their position on the matter clear, and Ezekiel became foreman of the Double C in April of 1884. It changed their material circumstances in ways that were immediately and practically welcome. The foreman's wages were better, and the stability that came with the role was the kind of stability that allows a family to make plans that extend beyond the next season. They began, carefully and over time, to talk about land of their own. This was the dream at the center of the frontier, the one that brought people west and kept them working past the point of reasonable comfort, the piece of land that was yours, not borrowed or earned by the month but owned, the thing you could leave to your children. Texas in 1884 still had land to be claimed and bought, though the best of the open range was being fenced, and the days of unlimited grazing were clearly numbered, and a man with steady wages and a reputation for reliability and good sense could, with time and discipline, accumulate what was needed. They saved. This was not a romantic activity, but it was a purposeful one, and they did it with the shared determination of people working toward the same thing. Naomi's seamstress work continued and expanded, and she had 3 girls she was teaching now, and the small income from teaching added to what they were setting aside. They lived carefully, not joylessly, but with an eye on the number that was growing in the redemption bank. Thomas grew. He was 2 years old in November of 1885, walking with a confidence that suggested the floor had no business being as far from vertical as it was, getting into everything in the cabin with the focused determination of a small person who has decided that curiosity is his primary occupation. He had learned to say his father's name, which he pronounced Zeke with a certainty that made Ezekiel laugh every time, and he had learned the word mama and the word no and the word horse in that order, which probably said something about their household that Naomi found amusing. She was expecting again, which she told Ezekiel in the same direct way she had told him the first time, at the kitchen table after supper, though this time she was smiling when she said it, which she had not entirely been the first time because the first time had contained more uncertainty. He was not less moved by it the second time, which she had wondered about, whether it would be different. It was not different. He got up from his side of the table and came around and held her, and she felt his hand on her hair, and he said her name again in that way he had, and it was exactly as complete as the first time. The second child was a girl, born in the summer of 1886, and they named her Ruth, after no one in particular but because the name seemed to carry something of the weight and tenderness that they wanted to name her with. She was smaller than Thomas had been and more serene, with her mother's dark hair and brown eyes and a disposition that was, from the beginning, observant and self-possessed. Thomas greeted her arrival with the mixed feelings of a toddler being asked to share his world with an interloper, but settled into his role as older brother within a few weeks with a gruff protectiveness that was entirely his father's. Clara Aldridge came to visit in the fall of 1886. She arrived on the train from Wichita with a bag that turned out to contain more gifts for the children than it seemed physically possible to fit in a bag of that size, and she stood on the platform and embraced Naomi for a long time and said, "Well, you look extremely well." "I am extremely well," Naomi said. Clara looked at Ezekiel, who had come to the station with Naomi and was standing a few feet away holding Thomas on his hip, and said, "You must be the man who sent one word." "I am," he said. Clara regarded him for a moment with the frank assessment of a woman who has been watching out for this particular young woman for years and has her own opinions about what she deserves. Then she nodded once with the specificity of someone who has made a judgment and is satisfied with it. "Good," she said. Clara stayed for 2 weeks and was incorporated into the household with the ease of someone who has always been family and is simply occupying that role in person for the first time. She sat with Ruth for hours. The baby seemed fascinated by her, and she and Agnes Holbrook, who came to supper 3 times during Clara's visit, discovered a mutual interest in the kind of conversation that involves covering a great deal of ground in a short time, and formed an immediate friendship that they maintained afterward by letter. On the last evening of her visit, Clara and Naomi sat on the cabin porch in the September dark while Ezekiel put Thomas to bed inside and the baby slept, and they talked in the way that old friends talk when they know they have a limited amount of time and want to use it well. "Are you happy?" Clara said, and not the kind of happy that you say when someone asks because it's the appropriate answer, the real kind. Naomi thought about this for a moment, giving it the consideration it deserved. "Yes," she said, "the real kind." I don't mean that nothing is hard or that every day is wonderful, because some days are difficult and we argue sometimes and the work is constant and Texas is not always gentle. But I mean that I am where I want to be, with who I want to be with, doing something that feels like my life rather than a life I am keeping until my life arrives. Yes, the real kind. Clara reached over and covered her hand. Good, she said. That's what I wanted to know. The land came in 1887. It was 160 acres on the north side of a creek called the Bitter Fork, which was not actually bitter, but had gotten the name from a surveyor who was apparently in a negative frame of mind when he passed through. The land had a good water situation and a stand of cottonwoods along the creek and rolling grassland that had been grazed before but not recently. And it was close enough to the Double C that Ezekiel could continue his work as foreman while they began the long project of making the land their own. The purchase took all of what they had saved, and a loan from the Redemption Bank at terms that were fair, from a banker named Clifford Morse who had known Holly's crew for 20 years, and who applied the principle that reliable men with good records deserve the chance to improve their situations. It was the largest financial commitment either of them had ever made, and Naomi sat with Clifford Morse on the day they signed the papers with a composure that did not show the magnitude of what it felt like inside, which was something like standing at the edge of a very large step and committing to the ground on the other side. They began to build. This was again a community project in the way that things in Redemption tended to be, with people coming out on the weekends when they could be spared from their own work to help with the construction of the house that would eventually replace the cabin at the Double C as their home. The house went up through the spring and summer of 1887 with the physical involvement of Holly's and Meredith crew, of Samuel and Renata Vega, of Agnes Hallbrook's son-in-law, who had come from San Antonio for a visit and stayed to help because the project was more interesting than anything he had planned, of Dewey Stratton, who had retired but had opinions about construction and was useful in spite of himself. Ezekiel worked on it every evening and every weekend with the intensity of a man who knows that the thing he is building is not just a structure but a proof of something. And Naomi worked alongside him on the days when the children could be managed with help, and on the days when they could not. She was aware of the hammer sounds in the distance like a conversation she was not present for but could hear. Thomas, who was 4 years old by the time the house was going up, regarded the construction as a personal adventure and was supervised at building sites with the vigilance that 4-year-olds at building sites require. Ruth, at a year old, had no opinion about construction, but had a great deal of opinion about everything else, having come into full voice in a way that suggested she had a lot to say and intended to say it. The house was finished in August of 1887, and they moved into it on a Saturday with the help of everyone who had helped build it. And that evening, there was a gathering that was not quite a party but had the feel of one, with food and the fiddle player who had played at their wedding coming back for the occasion. And Naomi stood in the kitchen of her own house, and felt the weight of the walls around her with a gratitude that was almost physical. Ezekiel found her standing like that, with her hands braced on the kitchen table and her head slightly bowed, and he came and stood behind her and put his hands over hers on the table, and they stood like that for a moment in the kitchen of their house while the sounds of the gathering came in from outside. "We did it," she said. "We did," he said. "I keep thinking about standing on a train platform in Wichita with no idea what I was going to find." "What did you find?" She turned to look at him, her back against the table, and looked at his face that she knew so well by now, the gray eyes and the scar along his jaw and the way his smile changed everything, and she said, "Everything I needed." He kissed her then in the kitchen of their house, while the fiddle played outside, and the children were somewhere with Meredith crew, and the cottonwoods along the Bitter Fork moved in the August evening air. And it was not a dramatic kiss in the sense that the world rearranged itself around them, but it was a real one, the kind between two people who know each other completely and choose each other anyway. The years moved forward in the way that good years do, steadily and with increasing richness. Ezekiel's work as foreman of the Double C continued through the late 1880s and into the new decade, and the Lawson land grew with it. Another 40 acres added in 1889 when the neighbor to the east sold a portion of his property. And the herd of cattle they were building slowly with the profits from the ranch work grew from a few head to a sustainable number. It was not a large cattle operation, not anything that would make a man wealthy by the standards that the territory used to measure wealth, but it was theirs and it was working. Thomas started school in Redemption in 1888, which required a 4-mile ride into town each day that he accomplished with a seriousness of purpose that his father found deeply funny, since the purpose was both the education and the independence of riding in himself. And these two things seemed to be of roughly equal importance to a 5-year-old boy. Ruth started 2 years later, and she was a different kind of student than Thomas. Where he was steady and industrious, she was quick and occasionally impatient. But the teacher, a young woman named Elaine Forbes who had come out from Missouri, found her more engaging than trouble. Naomi continued her seamstress work through these years in the way that women's work on the frontier continues, fitting around everything else, done in the hours that could be found and setting aside when they could not. She had given up teaching formally, since the school had absorbed that need, but she continued to sew and to take in work from the surrounding county, and to be the person in the community who could look at a piece of fabric and see what it wanted to become. This was not her whole self, but it was a part of herself she valued, the skill and the craft and the quiet meditative quality of the work. She also became, in these years, one of the people in Redemption who others came to when they needed someone to think with. This was not a formal role, and she would not have described herself in those terms, but it was real. Young women who had come to the territory and were navigating its difficulties came to her. Women in difficult marriages who needed someone to hear them without judgment came to her. Renata Vega brought her the specific difficulties of being a Mexican woman in a town that did not always know how to hold that. And Naomi listened with the care of someone who knows that listening is not passive, but is instead the most active thing you can offer another person. The 90s came to Redemption with change, as the 90s came to the whole territory with change. The frontier was closing in the formal sense. The census had declared it and the politicians had noted it. And what that meant in practical terms was that the land was filling in, and the open range that had defined the cattle industry was being replaced by fenced properties and different economic structures. The big trail drives were increasingly a thing of the past, replaced by the railroads that took cattle directly from ranches without the long drives north, and the men who had defined themselves by those drives found that the world they had built their identities around was becoming historical faster than they had expected. Ezekiel felt this, though he was not a man who talked about it in terms of loss. He had adapted to it throughout his 30s, understanding that the foreman of a ranching operation in 1892 was managing a different enterprise than the trail hand of 1882, more administratively complex and less physically romantic, though the animals were the same, and the land was the same, and the fundamental skills were the same. He was good at it, and Holly's crew's appreciation for him remained consistent, and the Double C was weathering the economic changes of the period better than many operations, because it had been managed with the kind of practical attention that keeps a thing from becoming overextended. The Lawson land continued to develop. By 1892, the house had a second room added to accommodate the growing children, and the property had a chicken coop and a proper barn and a kitchen garden that Naomi ran with a productivity that impressed their neighbors. And the cattle herd on their own land had grown to a size that was beginning to provide a meaningful secondary income. It was not yet self-sufficient as an operation, not without Ezekiel's foreman wages from the Double C, but it was becoming more itself, more clearly a ranch rather than a property with some animals on it. Thomas was 9 years old in 1892 and had become a serious boy who was interested in everything but particularly in the horses, which was perhaps inevitable given his environment. And he had a way with them that Ezekiel recognized as something more than learned skill, the same quality he had seen in a few men over the years, the natural communication with horses that some people are born with and others can approximate but not replicate. He had given the boy responsibility for the horses on their own property, real responsibility with real consequences, and Thomas had met it with a steadiness that made his father think that some things are carried in the bones. Ruth was 7 and was in the middle of what she would later describe as her campaign to understand everything, which meant that she asked questions at a volume and rate that occasionally exhausted the people around her, but that Naomi met with a willingness that was genuine, because the questions Ruth asked were genuinely interesting questions. She wanted to know how the telegraph worked, which led to a visit to Percy Finch's office that Percy would remember as the most interrogative hour of his professional life. She wanted to know why the sky was blue and how far away the stars were, and what happened to the cattle after they left the ranch, and where the creek went, and whether fish remembered things. She was 7 years old and she was already, clearly, going to be someone who mattered to the world. Agnes Holbrook died in the winter of 1893, peacefully in her sleep, in the house on the east side of Main Street that she had occupied for more than 30 years. She was 67 years old and she had been in declining health for a year, and she died as she had lived, with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of dignity, having arranged her affairs and said what she needed to say to the people she needed to say it to. She had said to Naomi the week before she went, "You came to this town and made it better. I want you to know that I see that." Naomi had held her hands and said, "You made it possible." She was buried in the Redemption Cemetery on a January day with a cold wind coming off the flats, and Naomi stood at the graveside with Ezekiel's hand in hers and thought about all the forms that family can take, the ones you are born into and the ones you find and the ones you build in the places, and with the people that life puts in front of you. And she thought that Agnes Holbrook had been the latter two kinds, and that the grief of losing her was the kind that comes from losing someone who made a material difference to the shape of your life. She wrote to Clara. Clara wrote back a long and warm letter full of her own grief at the news, because she had met Agnes and loved her, and the exchange of those letters over the following month was one of the ways that Naomi worked through the loss, the written conversation with a woman 2 states away who understood what it meant. Spring came again as it always did, with the light changing first and then the temperature, and then the land waking up in the color green that the Texas plains produced briefly and brilliantly, before the summer burned it back to copper. The Lawson property in spring was a particular kind of beautiful, with the cottonwoods along the Bitter Fork putting out their new leaves in a green so pale it was almost silver, and the cattle moving on the grass, and the house solid and settled on its rise as if it had always been there. Ezekiel was 38 years old in the spring of 1893, which was not old but was past the point at which he had expected his life to look this way, which is to say this full, this settled, this much itself. He had not been a man who imagined a detailed future when he was younger, the way some men do. He had lived in the present of the work and the season and the drive, and had not looked far ahead, because looking far ahead is a luxury that a certain kind of life does not encourage. But here was the far ahead, the thing he had not exactly planned, and he stood on the rise by his house in the April morning with the creek sound coming up from below, and thought that this was more than he had known to want, which is the best possible thing to think about what you have. He found Naomi in the kitchen, because that was where she often was in the morning, making the day begin with the domestic industry that she brought to everything. She was 31 years old and she was, if he was honest about it, more beautiful to him now than she had been when she walked into the crew's parlor that first afternoon, which he understood was not a logical statement, but which was nonetheless true. She had a depth to her now that the years had added, the specific depth that comes from living fully and thinking carefully and feeling honestly, and she wore it in the way people wear things that are genuinely theirs. She looked up when he came in and said, "Coffee is ready," which was not a romantic thing to say, but was an entirely practical and loving one. He poured his coffee and sat at the table, and she sat across from him, and they were comfortable in the quiet that has earned its comfort, the quiet between two people who have talked about everything and are resting in the knowledge that there will be more to say and more time to say it. "I was thinking," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was thinking that we should write to Clara and invite her for a proper visit, not a week, longer." Naomi looked at him with the expression she wore when he had said something that pleased her more than she expected. "I was thinking the same thing," she said. "I know," he said. She laughed. "Do you? You have the look you get when you're planning something but waiting to see if I'll think of it first." She shook her head, but she was still smiling. "Write the letter tonight," she said. "After supper," he said. Clara came in June and stayed 6 weeks, and the visit was the kind that becomes part of a family's story, the summer Clara came and the things that happened during it. She fell deeply in love with the children, Thomas, who showed her every horse on the property, with the pride of a curator giving a private tour, and Ruth, who asked her so many questions over the first 3 days that Clara said she needed to rest in a way she had not needed to rest since an illness in 1879. She and Renata Vega found common ground in the particular humor of women who have seen enough of the world to be selective about what they take seriously. And the three of them, Clara and Renata and Naomi, had evenings on the Lawson porch that were the kind that get remembered as the best of their kind. Clara went home in late July with the specific sadness of someone who has found a place that is not theirs but that they love anyway, and she and Naomi stood at the train station in Redemption and embraced for a long time, and Naomi said, "Thank you for that money for the train ticket," and Clara said, "Don't be ridiculous. You paid it back years ago," and Naomi said, "I don't mean the money, I mean the decision," and Clara understood what she meant and held her tighter. The years continued to accumulate. Ezekiel's father died in 1895, a fact communicated by letter from a cousin in Missouri that took 3 weeks to arrive, and the news landed in a complicated way because the relationship had been complicated, and grief for complicated fathers is its own particular kind of work. Naomi sat with him through the evenings of that week and said nothing much but was present, which was exactly the right thing, and he said eventually, "I wanted it to be different, the whole thing. I wanted to be different to him, and I wanted him to be different back." "I know," she said. "I don't think I ever stopped wanting that." "No," she said. "I don't think those kinds of wanting ever fully go away. They just become something you carry rather than something that stops you." He looked at her for a moment in the lamp light. "How did you get so wise?" he said. "I am not particularly wise," she said. "I just pay attention." Thomas was 12 in 1895 and had become the kind of boy that people in the county knew by name and by reputation, not for trouble but for the horsework, the word having gotten around that Holly's crew's foreman's boy had a gift, and 2 neighboring ranchers had already made informal inquiries about having him work with their horses during the summers. Ezekiel had said he was too young, which was right, but he had said it with the pride of a man who can afford to wait because the thing he is proud of is not going anywhere. Ruth at 10 was the reader of the household, having exhausted the small library of the Redemption School and begun petitioning her parents for books that had to be ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio, which Naomi accommodated because she recognized in her daughter the particular hunger that books feed, and because the money could be managed. Ruth wanted to know about everything, and she read about everything: history and natural science and stories and geography and mathematics, and she was already, at 10, someone whose intelligence was clearly going to take her past what redemption could offer, which was both a gift and a complication. Naomi was expecting their third child in the fall of 1897, which was later than they had expected a third child, but which arrived nonetheless with the natural timing of these things. She was 35, which was not young for another child but was not remarkable either, and she was in good health and had the experience of 2 previous children to draw on, and she was ready in the particular way of someone who knows what is coming and has made her peace with the difficulty of it because the outcome is worth it. The third child was born in December of 1897, on a cold and clear night with stars that were sharp as cut glass outside the window. This time it was a boy again, and Naomi named him first while Ezekiel sat on the edge of the bed holding him, because she had the name already and she wanted to say it. "Samuel," she said. For no specific reason except that it fits him. Ezekiel looked at the boy, at the small wrinkled face and the perfect hands and the entirely fresh quality of someone who has just arrived in the world and has not yet decided what to make of it. "Samuel Lawson," he said. "Yes, that fits." Thomas was 14 by then and regarded his new brother with a teenage boy's careful calibration of not showing too much failing, but he was seen, more than once in those first weeks, sitting by the cradle and making the faces that babies respond to, and no one mentioned it to him because everyone understood. Ruth, 11 years old, was simply entranced. She held Samuel with a seriousness that was almost scientific, studying him the way she studied everything, and she asked the midwife Sarah a series of questions about infant development that Sarah said afterward were the most thorough questions she had ever been asked by an 11-year-old. The years of the late 1890s settled into the fullness of a family that had found its shape and was growing within it. The Lawson property was established now, genuinely a ranch rather than a hope of one, with a herd that was productive and land that was managed well, and a reputation in the county that was built from years of honest dealing and reliable work. Ezekiel had considered stepping back from the double C foreman position as his own operation grew, and Holly's crew, who was now in his 70s and had begun the process of thinking about what the ranch would look like without him, had understood when the conversation came, and they had arranged a reduced arrangement through 1899 before Ezekiel finished the transition fully to their own land in 1900. The new century arrived in redemption with the usual combination of ceremony and practical indifference. The ceremony from people who found the turning of a century symbolically significant, and the indifference from cattle, which do not observe calendars. There was a gathering at the church on New Year's Eve, and Reverend Marsh, now in his 60s and somewhat slower but unchanged in the warmth of his manner, spoke about the future with the careful optimism of a man who has seen enough of what the future becomes to be appropriately humble about predicting it. Ezekiel and Naomi stood in the church on the first hour of 1900, and Ezekiel looked at his wife in the candlelight. 17 years of marriage and 37 years of her actual life, lived fully and completely. And he thought that the word he had sent north on a telegraph wire in the autumn of 1882 had been the best word he had ever said in any form, and that everything he was standing in had come from it. Or rather had come from the woman who had received it and made the choice to answer it with herself. She caught him looking and raised her eyebrow in the way she had, the small gesture that asked a question without committing to which question it was. "I was thinking about a telegram," he said. She understood immediately because she had been thinking about it too. It seemed to come back to them at moments of significance, that small word sent across the distance. "One word," she said. "The best word," he said. She took his hand in the candlelight of the church on the first night of 1900, and around them their children were present, Thomas 16, and already the young man he was becoming, Ruth 14, and already reading the world with the sharp intelligence that was entirely her own. Samuel 2 years old, and in the arms of Meredith Crew, who had appointed herself his second grandmother, and who he accepted with the equanimity of a small person who has always been surrounded by people who love him. It was a complete picture, not perfect because nothing human is perfect, but complete in the sense of a thing that has reached its fullness and is resting in it, which is better than perfect in most of the ways that matter. The 20th century that followed was a different country in many ways, with electricity coming to the larger towns and the automobile beginning its long replacement of the horse, and the economic structures of the cattle industry changing again and again, as the world continued its business of becoming something other than what it had been. But those changes came slowly to places like Redemption, Texas, and the Lawson Ranch on the Bitter Fork was insulated from the fastest of them by the basic nature of what it was, land and animals and the people who tended them, which changes more slowly than most things. Thomas married in 1904 a girl named Eliza from a neighboring ranch, and set up his own horse training operation on a portion of Lawson land that Ezekiel and Naomi were happy to give him because watching a child build something was one of the pleasures that their particular life had taught them to value. Ruth went to a women's college in San Antonio in 1905, the first person in the family to receive a formal higher education, and she came back to the territory 2 years later, not to Redemption specifically but to the county seat, where she took up a position as a school teacher and eventually became the principal of the county school, a position she held for many years and in which she was, by every account, extraordinary. Samuel grew up on the ranch and had his father's quietness and his mother's directness and a stubbornness that seemed to be entirely his own, and he was the one who eventually took over the operation of the Lawson property in the years when Ezekiel's body began to request the retirement that his mind was reluctant to grant. He married in 1920, which is the beginning of another story, and he and his wife Lucy added the third generation to the land along the Bitter Fork. But that is looking ahead in the way that this story does not need to look ahead, because the story is complete at a point that is more satisfying than the administrative continuation of family and property. It is complete in the moment on a summer morning in 1910 when Ezekiel Lawson, 54 years old and gray at the temples, and still capable of a full day's work when he chose to put his mind to it, sits on the porch of the house he built on the Bitter Fork and watches Naomi come out from the kitchen door with 2 cups of coffee and her dark hair only slightly threaded with gray and her eyes exactly the same as they were in the cruise parlor in October of 1882, and sits beside him without ceremony because sitting beside him is one of the things that she has always done. He takes the coffee and they sit in the morning that is starting to heat up in the way of Texas mornings in June, and the land is green and copper and silver in the creek light, and somewhere in the house Samuel is making the sounds of a 12-year-old getting ready for school, and from the direction of Thomas's place there is the sound of horses, and Ruth is in the county seat doing the work she was made for, and Agnes Hallbrook is in the Redemption Cemetery on the east side of town, and Clara Aldridge is in Wichita growing old with the satisfaction of someone who made a good decision in handing a young woman a train ticket and saying, "Don't argue with me." "Do you know what I was thinking about?" Naomi says. "No," he says, which is one of the things he has always liked about their conversations, that he genuinely does not always know, even after all these years. "I was thinking about Percy Finch," she says. "I wonder if he's still telling the story." Ezekiel considers this. Percy Finch retired from the Telegraph office in 1906 and is still, to the best of anyone's knowledge, alive and living with his daughter in Austin. "I would bet considerably on it," he says. "He should be," she says. "It's a good story." "It is," Ezekiel says. She looks at him over her coffee cup with the expression that he has known for 28 years, and that still has the capacity to produce in him the same feeling it produced when she was 24 years old in a Kansas seamstress shop threading a needle by window light, a feeling of absolute, complete recognition, the feeling of something arriving where it was always going. "One word," she says. "The right word," he says. She reaches over and takes his free hand, and he holds it, and the morning continues to happen around them, the land and the light and the sound of their life going on in all its directions, and the bitter fork moves in its channel between the cottonwoods in the way that water moves, without asking permission and without stopping, carrying everything it has picked up along the way toward something it cannot see, but is moving toward nonetheless. And that is the whole of it. The story that began with a cowboy walking into a telegraph office in Redemption, Texas, with mud on his boots and a certainty in his chest that one word was enough, because he had chosen the word carefully, and the word was everything he needed it to be, and it was enough, and more than enough. And the woman 2 states away who received it was the kind of woman who heard what was underneath it, and she came. And they built something together on a piece of land along a creek in the country that was too rough for some people and exactly right for others. And they loved each other through all of it, through the hard years and the easy ones and the years that were simply long and full. And what they made together was a life, and the life was good. And the single word at the beginning of it was the truest thing that was ever sent down a wire.